facility out by Sydney during the Second World War, and her research into that. On March 6th, we're going to be having Dr. William Stoudemire and Logan Osmera, who's an undergraduate research fellow in the history department, speaking about Loop City's Jenner's Park, which some of you might remember. It was a zoo and a curiosity cabinet sort of place. They had mummies and all sorts of other curios on display in Loop City, and so they'll be talking about their efforts to kind of conduct research on this space. And then on April 10th, Brock Anderson from the Buffalo County Historical Society, as well as the UNK History Department, will be speaking about the Red Shirt winter count, which was a Lakota winter count that he actually recovered and repatriated to the Red Shirt family. And so he'll be speaking about this important text and important document that he was able to locate. But today, we have Dr. Jim Rohrer from the Department of History, and he'll be speaking on American religion in the golden age of postcards. Dr. Rohrer is a native of the Buckeye State with degrees in history from Kent State University and the Ohio State University, where he received his master's degree and doctoral degree.
Get that V.
Yeah. And also Masters of Divinity from the University of Dubuque Theological Seminary. Dr. Rohrer specializes in early American history, American religious history, and the history of Christianity, and has written books about early American congregationalism, as well as Protestant missionaries in Taiwan and elsewhere. He has collected postcards, old photos, and prints for over 50 years, and if you have the opportunity, he has quite the collection of materials, which I think we're going to see some highlights and gems from today. And this talk largely draws on this collection. So without further ado, Dr. Rohrer.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Okay. So one bit of shameless self-promotion. I am going to be teaching a senior college class this semester. I have not yet been told which dates. And it's a course entitled Chapters in American Religious History. And so you can kind of consider this as a preview of what to expect and some of those things. Now, my guess is that all of you, or at least most of you, have sent postcards or received postcards in your life. My guess is also in the last few years, you probably have not. Okay. Obviously, postcards, along with the old traditional snail mail letters, are a dying technology or a dying form of communication. Not much need for them anymore when we can send photos electronically or use social media. So we need to go back 120 some years to when postcards were a new technology. And they actually had a very profound impact, not only on American culture, but global culture. In the 19th century, from the Civil War on, the government printed 1-cent postcards that you could go to a post office, you could get a postcard, and you could send a message to somebody for 1 cent. But the government did not allow privately published postcards, nor did they allow any alteration of their postcards. So you couldn't put a photo on it, for example, legally. So they were useful for business purposes, but they didn't become a fad. And then in 1898, the US Congress ended its monopoly and privatized the production of postcards. May 19th, for those of you who are sticklers on dates, Congress passed a law which allowed private printers and publishers to produce postcards and to post them at the rate of 1 cent. And they could put photos on them or design them any way they wanted to. So between roughly 1900 to the American entry into World War I in 1917, Americans posted literally billions of postcards. 1908 alone, nearly 700 million postcards were posted, which was more than 20 for every man, woman, and child in the United States. Now, the impact of this was profound. And to really understand the impact, we also have to look a little bit at some allied or cognate technology. So the Kodak company got in the act very quickly. They saw potential in this. And in 1903, Kodak, by the way, it was the postcard that made Kodak the go-to camera of choice for middle-class Americans. They introduced this camera right here, the 3A folding pocket Kodak, which was designed to hold postcard-sized film. And then, so consumers could take a photograph and have it printed on the back of the postcard. Then, in 1907, they introduced a service called Real Photo Postcards, which would allow people to take pictures with any camera of any size, take it to a developer, and have it turned into a Kodak postcard. And this 1907 development coincided with another congressional law which allowed publishers to divide the backs of cards. Now this is important. From 1898 to 1907, the government said private people can print cards, but you can only put nothing on one side except the address. You can't write on it, which meant that until 1907, photo postcards, or postcards with images on the front, always have writing on them. It's really frustrating when you're a historian and you find this image of a one-of-a-kind event, and it's obliterated by all the ink that people have written over it, right? Then in 1907, the law was changed to divide the back so people could have an address on one side, which they were not allowed to write on, but then on the other side, there was space that they could write a message. And so the combination of the ability to make a personalized image, connect it to a personalized message, and to post it for only 1 cent, made it possible for Americans of every social class to communicate with other people with unprecedented immediacy. And this marks the first time that large numbers of Americans began to actually make photographs themselves. In the 19th century, photographs were usually taken by professional photographers with studios. Now, they're still going to be in the act. Studios are going to be out there publishing photos and creating photo postcards by the millions. But now, average John Doe and Jane Doe Americans with their little Kodak camera can get in the business of playing with photographs themselves. And boy, did they. Sometimes we call this personal journalism. They were wildly successful. So professional photographers that had the money could hire, studios could hire photographers and send them all over the world to war zones, for example, to take images that they could then turn into postcards. Postcards were oftentimes published in a number of sets to encourage collecting. And postcards were often kept in display albums. So in parlors or sitting rooms, people would oftentimes have an album with their postcard collection in it. And customized photo cards that average people would take allowed individuals and small companies or groups to easily create their own picture postcards. And you can do it in a matter of just an hour. You take the picture, you take it to the local drugstore, you ask them to turn it into a postcard, you wait an hour, and voila, you got your card. So travelers could share with family and friends the places and people that they visited. People could record and share the everyday events of their life, both mundane and significant, with people far away. Fathers and mothers could keep in contact with little Billy and Susie when they went away to college, sending things like their pictures of their churches or Sunday schools with reminders that this is their new go to church. I have a lot of those. Postcard depicting current events were frequently the only means by which people could easily obtain visual information about happenings of the day. One historian, Naomi Shore, has said that the postcards functioned like a cross between the modern print and communications media. Something like CNN, People Magazine, Sports Illustrated, and National Geographic all rolled into one. All right, now, I am particularly interested in my collection. I have all kinds of stuff, not just religion, but I specialize in the history of religious culture. And so I've been particularly interested in gathering up images that focus on what I call religion, what we call religion as lived. Religion as lived gets at how average people actually live out their religious beliefs in their daily lives. Now, most people obviously are not ministers or theologians or religious leaders. They don't create religious texts like the Bhagavad Gita or biblical texts. They don't write theology books or preach sermons. So for most of history, it's difficult. It's always a challenge to get at religion as lived. Postcards allow us to have an unrivaled window into religion as lived in the early 20th century. People chronicled every aspect of their lives, including their religious practices, and religious organizations were very quick to see in postcards opportunities to advertise, evangelize, recruit, organize, and mobilize religious crusades, as I will illustrate in a moment. What we have here, by the way, is a real photo postcard detail of an outdoor baptism, sure, in 1908. I do not know the location because, unfortunately, people did not always identify for future historians where the image was taken, but it was from the family album of a Nebraska family, and a lot of the other images were identified as Nebraska locations. So I'm assuming it's probably Nebraska. It certainly looks flat and Great Plains in the background, but I'm not positive about that, nor am I sure where the location is. But it's an example of an image of religion as lived that I think is really precious. Or this example, this is two female workers in a tent revival meeting before the crowds arrive, on their knees in the sawdust praying, about 1910. Here we have the good people, or at least the good Methodist people of Humboldt, Nebraska, gathered for the laying of the cornerstone of their new Methodist Episcopal Church in October 31st, Halloween, 1908. Or these two. This one on the left is Sister Clara Lentz of Dubuque, Iowa, obviously a very young woman, in her wedding gown. She has just taken her initial vow as a bride of Christ, 1901. And then on the other side, we have the Sunday school superintendent of Carlton, Nebraska, who didn't name himself. He just called himself Santa. And it's obviously a Christmas greeting of him that he sent to his Sunday school kids. And here we have a Sunday morning circa 1910 in Loomis, Nebraska. And you will notice that the cars have now caught on. You also notice that they have not got around to putting a parking lot outside of the church yet. So when I see this, I kind of think, when these people showed up for church in their Sunday best on a rainy or snowy day, what did they look like when they got home? I wonder about that. All right, now, what I want to focus on in the rest of this class is what I call the Protestant Crusade. It's not what I call it, what we call the Protestant Crusade. Ever since the Puritans first arrived back in the 1620s, American Protestants have sought to shape society to conform to their own vision of biblical godliness. And oftentimes this has taken the form of excluding groups that do not conform to their vision, or failing this, to convert them to Protestant Christianity and to reform them. And it's also led throughout our history to repeated efforts to purify America of its perceived social evils and to police the moral behavior of citizens. Anybody who studies the history of American reform movements, going all the way back to the beginning, will know the very prominent role played by Protestant Christians in many of these movements. Now, there's nothing new about this in the golden age of postcards, but what was new in the early 20th century was the absolute incredibly amount of money involved in Protestant organizations, the gigantic size of these organizations, and the global scope of their vision, which dwarfed all earlier reform periods. And I have here what I find is rather interesting. A lot of people don't know, we used to, for about one and a half decades, there was a national park in Colorado called the Mount of the Holy Cross Park. And then it went the way of the dodo bird, which I'd like to write an article about this. It's on my, when I get around to it, things. But one of the most common images from the first decade of the 20th century on postcards was the Mount of the Holy Cross. Now, obviously, Colorado put out a lot, and the Union Pacific Railroad published a lot because you could see it from one of their lines. But it shows up all over the place, even on stuff not put up by Colorado or the Colorado hotels or the railroad. And it's because Protestants saw this as a natural crusader's cross. And they used it as a sign, their own mind, divine sign, since obviously God made the mountain, of America's identity, its essential identity as a Christian nation. So it's linked to the idea of manifest destiny. And it's going to show up over and over again, and it'll pop up later in this presentation in some strange ways. Now, it's important to understand that at this time, American churches, of course, for those of you who go to church, you know Christians never ever disagree with each other or divide over any issues. This is the beginning of what we call the modernist fundamentalist split. And so Protestants at this time are divided into two sometimes hostile camps, both of them committed to a Christian nation, however, and to world missions, but they had differing emphases. So there is one group that we call modernists, and they stressed what we call the social gospel. They saw America threatened by Catholicism, Mormonism, socialism, intemperance, that is to say, alcoholic drink, corrupt wealth, urbanization, and immigration. They believed that Christians should respond to these threats through educational efforts and through aggressive social programs to alleviate the socioeconomic problems confronting society. Now, there was another more conservative group of Christians, and it was not until 1909 called the fundamentalists. But it's an emerging fundamentalist movement. They perceived the same threats as the modernists did, but they insisted that the core underlying problem was sin, and they had very little confidence to no confidence in social programs to alleviate the problems. So they believed only evangelism and personal conversion could save people and save the nation. And they responded by mounting emotional revival meetings in cities and villages across the nation. Now, despite the tensions between these two groups, particularly at the leadership level, at the local grassroots level, a lot of John and Jane Doe Christians in small towns all over America actually had their foot in both camps. They were participating in organizations and contributing money that was linked to both of these. And there were lots of people who would have probably theologically put themselves in the modernist camp without using that name, who showed up at revival meetings. So this is not an absolute, clear-cut dichotomy. We have here part of a series of 50. I have 49 of the 50. Evangelistic postcards put out by a fundamentalist organization. And they would, because it was only 1 cent to mail these, they would take these evangelistic cards and they would send them to every post box in communities. So just mass mailing these all over the United States. All right. Sunday schools were supported by both of these two groups. Both camps regarded religious education as the key to forging a Christian nation and spreading the gospel around the world. So Sunday schools back then were not like Sunday schools today, where you just send Billy and Buffy during the church to play with flannel grapes. Sunday schools and many other missionary organizations, especially targeting youth, were organized across denominations, and these served as the foundation of the Protestant crusade. They were very, very much socially and politically active organizations. And this guy right here, his name is Rohrer, who's one of the leaders of the Sunday school movement in America. Says, I'm a Sunday school man because I believe a boy is worth more than a man. A girl is worth more than a woman, because I believe it is better to train up young people to be good citizens, Christian citizens, than it is to make laws to punish them when they become bad citizens. Because I believe the Sunday school is the best agency in the world for doing this. So this underscores, I think, very nicely the explicitly social agenda that was, civic agenda that was motivating the Sunday school crusade. Now, this is a boring slide because there's no image. Excuse me for the wordiness, but it is relevant to what I'm going to show you. So, Protestants feared that unbridled capitalism and corrupt wealth was a problem, but they, not surprisingly, embraced the modern corporation as the model for organizing their missionary work, which they believed ought to be guided by principles of business efficiency. So on the one hand, they see capitalism as a problem. On the other hand, they are completely suffused by the capitalist spirit, and they use a capitalist form of organizing to get their work done. So during the late 19th century, Sunday school leaders in many Protestant denominations conceived of creating what they called a unified system of graded classes that would seamlessly embrace and mold Christians from birth, or it's called the cradle roll department, to old age, the senior department. And in each class, at each level, there would be age-appropriate tactics and techniques and methods of teaching that would be designed to kind of inculcate the duties of Christian discipleship and to mobilize these people for active missionary service in their local community, the nation, and the world. So Sunday school is understood as an instrument to change the world, not simply a way to teach your kids or your seniors. Each local congregation was understood as a missionary school. Each denomination would have a national board to coordinate its particular congregations, but then there would be uniform lesson plans that would guide weekly study across denominations, a regular union, county, and state convention every year to train volunteer teachers, and then national and international interdenominational conventions that would gather together regularly Sunday school workers from across the USA and indeed from around the world, both for fellowship but also for planning joint programs. So I'm going to give you the flavor of this now using postcards. So here we have a Presbyterian Board of Mission postcard. Boys and Girls Home Missionary Army. Our land for Christ. Notice the prominence of the flag, and notice there's the Mount of the Holy Cross. There. This certifies that Emma Ferguson, by the payment of 10, I'm assuming that's 10 cents and not $10, so 10,000, is enrolled as a soldier in the Boys and Girls Home Missionary Army. Or this one. The 20th Century Sunday School Crusaders, 1910. By this sign, conquer. This was a very common, if you'd gone into a church in almost any Protestant denomination in the early 20th century, you would have seen up in the front an American flag and in this banner. By this sign, conquer. We sometimes refer to Christian missionary activity in this era as the moral equivalent of imperialism. So Sunday school missionaries were employed by churches to go all over the United States and plant Sunday schools in communities that didn't have one, including communities that didn't have a church. So it was very common to find frontier communities in places like up in the mountains that didn't even have an organized church, but they had a Sunday school. Which I suppose if you were, even if you didn't go to church, if you had a little kid and you're tired, it's nice if somebody wants to come and take your kids for a couple of hours on Sunday morning. You can get rid of it. So, the Children for Christ. Here is a sod house someplace in the Plains, one of the homes visited by a Sabbath school missionary. And this little one, I think, is kind of telling. 131 Sunday schools with a membership of 5,218 were started in mining camps and county districts in Iowa during the year ending May 1st, 1910 by the missionaries of the American Sunday School Union. Now notice the language down here. 7 nationalities are represented in the above picture. It is American, English, Welsh, German, Slavic, Italian, and Negro. The Union Sunday School is organized by missionary E.G. Evans and is located in Marion County. So you can kind of see from this, part of the goal here is to find communities with large numbers of immigrant kids, and the term that they used was Americanize them. Now, Protestant leaders wanted their church members to organize their social lives around various church organizations and missionary activities. When you read the Sunday school literature today, this comes up very, very clearly. They don't want people going to things like football games, or God forbid, the theater, or bars, right, or taverns. They want them in church. And so the churches would have programming going on all during the week, all through the year. And the idea is that this consecrated fellowship and activity would then channel people's energies into wholesome and constructive streams and keep them inoculated against corrupt influences of worldly competing pastimes, which I suspect, as I say, is probably easier to achieve in small towns than large cities. At any rate, postcards were a convenient way of reminding people of all the activities, and as we will see in a minute, scolding them if they didn't show up. So here we have a 1909 New Year's greeting card reminding the ladies of the church that there's a big women's missionary conference coming up in August. Put it on your calendar. It's from New Wilmington, Pennsylvania. And then for people who missed Sunday school, there would be, well, also to invite people. So let's say that you're new in the town and you're not a member of the Sunday school. They would keep tabs on everybody in the town, and then you might get a card like this. We're looking for you. I love the hats. It will be a big joy to welcome you into our splendid Sunday school class. We have the finest fellowship and delightful lesson hours. Join us in the work for Jesus. Come next Sunday. Now, what about people who are members of the Sunday schools but don't show up? If you're a lady, you might get this card. Not quite right enough. In our Sunday school in class last Sunday, do you know why? We didn't have the light of your countenance. We sure missed you. All of us did. Honest to goodness, we did. We confidently look for you next Sunday. Every member present next Sunday, you in your small corner and I in mine. And if you were a guy, you might get, Dear Ed, I'm sending this dog to hunt you up and find out what is the matter. He doesn't bark or bite. He's just a post dog. You were not at Sunday school today. We're afraid you're lost, strayed, or stolen, that something dreadful has happened. Do not know what tale of woe our dog will bring back, but we hope nothing very serious. When any one of our class stays away, we're sure there's something wrong. If you're sick, be sure to let me know in some way. Clark Hollingsworth, teacher. And then down below, don't forget to fill out the excuse blank on the other side of this card and bring it with you next Sunday. There's no manipulation or pressure involved in this. No. This is all just sincere, authentic religious piety. So as I say, the idea is to have everything organized and then to get this huge cadre of volunteer teachers and give them training in how to teach. So all over the United States, you would have found annual teachers' conventions, such as this one in Lyons, Nebraska. And you can see how many volunteers they have. This is from all over the county, by the way. And this was going on all over the United States. There were special magazines that Sunday school teachers could subscribe to that were monthly, that would have teaching methods and essays about psychology, and the psychology of young women, and the psychology of boys, and the psychology of older people, and how you go about integrating this into your approach as a Sunday school teacher. Another image this is from Omaha, Nebraska. A Sunday school teacher with your little kids ready to go into all the world. Look at the faces on these kids, and her face, for that matter. You get the idea that there was screaming and angry shouting going on right before this picture was taken. They just don't ring out to me like, crusaders of the cross. They look more like bored young men who want to be someplace else playing baseball, perhaps. At any rate, every denomination had its own system of Sunday schools, and then, as they say, there's the union efforts. So one of the largest organizations, this was interdenominational, there were classes for men called Baraka classes, and this is an Omaha Baraka class. And then from down in Franklin County, just south of here, is this pronounced Napanee or Naponi? Napanee? Okay. Here's young women from Napanee, and this is the Philadelphia class, the women. In 1910, there was about there's about 1,200,000 members of the Baraka and Philadelphia classes in the United States, representing about 15 different Protestant denominations. Now, there was this perception in the late 19th century that there was a crisis of Christian manhood. So throughout the 19th century, women dominated America's Protestant churches. Well over half of all baptized members were women. Much of the active membership of the various voluntary societies that engaged in various kinds of reform and mission work were women. And it was harder to get men and boys to go to Sunday school or to church. And there was widespread talk about this as a crisis of manhood. Many people concluded that part of the problem was that people didn't want to identify or get involved in an organization that they perceived as being for women. They also believed that there was a problem with popular portrayals of Jesus, who was oftentimes presented as effeminate, womanly, too meek and mild. So a movement emerged we call muscular Christianity to present Jesus as a man's man, a warrior, indeed. For any of you who've seen like billboards recently of the Rambo Jesus, this is sort of a modern day muscular Christianity on steroids. And then to present involvement in church and Sunday school as something that was for guys. And one of the manifestations of this was the creation of cadet corps in Sunday schools in many parts of the United States, such as these young men in Garrett's Cadets at the First Methodist Church in Gloversville, New York. A lot of times it would be older members that had been in the Civil War that were members of the GAR, who would volunteer their time to take the young men of the town under wing and teach them how to drill, and they'd get cool uniforms, and you can see they also have some of them actual guns, and they would drill in the churches. Now, not every church thought this was a good thing. There were churches, particularly, my own family background came out of what we call the Anabaptist tradition, like the Mennonites. They were pacifists, and so they didn't get involved in this. They had Sunday schools, but they didn't have cadet corps. But your Presbyterians and Methodists, Congregationalists, they were usually just fine with this. And so a lot of these churches had cadet corps. It's sort of like Boy Scouts, except with guns. Now, for many Protestants, a highlight on the annual social calendar was the Union Sunday School Parade and Picnic. And these were oftentimes held together on what was called Rally Day, but they would sometimes be split into different dates. And on these occasions, hundreds, or in some cases even thousands, of Sunday school participants from many different churches would parade through their community with banners as a sign to both themselves and to those who were not churched of their collective number and their social power or influence. Every town and city in America, virtually every town, big and little, had its Sunday school parades and picnics. And I have probably close to 1,000 images of these in my collection from every imaginable size of community. So at any rate, postcards richly document these events. To give you the flavor, our Rally Day song, this kind of really brings out the social and political dimensions of this. Little soldiers we will be, marching on to victory under Christ's own banner. Always fighting for the right, doing good with all our might. Jesus leads us to the fight, singing loud Hosanna. In our school, but in our play, doing something every day, soldiers of salvation. There is always work to do for his soldiers, brave and true. Work for me and work for you, each in his own station. So we'll march like soldiers true while there's work for us to do. Christ will give us power. We will always fight and pray. Christ our captain leads the way. He is with us every day, with us every hour. And you can see, literally hundreds of Rally Day postcards in this period, the fusion of the image of marching and soldiering, the cross, and the by this Son conquer, and the Bible all being kind of superimposed or blended together into one symbol. So this kind of just permeates. It's what we call civil religion and or Christian nationalism. So here is the Church of Christ, and this is not the Church of Christ denomination. This is the collective, united, union Church of Christ, the church militant. The Church of Christ in Bellefontaine, Ohio, they go to Sunday School Day Parade, July 2nd, 1916, attended 7,259. Here's Sunday School Parade in August 19th, 1910, in York, Nebraska. And a year later, in And then at the end of it, of course, you would have to eat dinner, because that's what Protestants do. Nowadays, it's kind of gone the way of the dodo bird in modern decades, but we still, of course, we have potluck dinners, right? I mean, for many people, you probably couldn't unpack the doctrine of the Trinity of the Savior's soul, but by golly, you know what potluck dinners are. So here we're having dinner in the city park of York in 1910, or this group from the same dinner. Now, I mentioned the conservative folks, or the fundamentalists, believed that what was really needed was personal conversion. So this is the golden age of American tent revivalism. The late 19th, early 20th century witnessed hundreds of evangelical revivalists annually hitting what was called the Sawdust Trail. And I mean, literally hundreds, and they would go from town to town all through the year. So in any given year, thousands of revivals would be held. And there were some that focused on small towns, and there were others that focused on big cities, as I will demonstrate in a moment. So in larger cities, these revivals would be held in large wooden tabernacles, and were oftentimes built by volunteers in a single day. And these tabernacles would hold thousands. Then in small towns, they would be held in canvas tents. The revivalists proclaimed to be a traditional version of Christianity, emphasizing personal sin and the need for conversion to faith in Christ, but they also were very overtly political and addressed highly politicized social issues of the day. So one of the things that would inevitably be part of a revival sermon would be booze. There was a very close connection between the revivalist movement and the prohibition movement. Now it's important to note that there were lots of people who were for prohibition that were not evangelical Christians or not Christians at all. It was a very broad gauge movement. But virtually all of the Protestants were involved on behalf of the prohibition movement. And so this is one component of the coalition that's going to achieve national prohibition in 1919. And here we have a tent meeting in Hastings, Nebraska, circa 1916, and this is the choir. So the revivalists would be outsiders. The local ministers would unite in hosting it. They would make sure that the tent was put up, or that the tabernacle was constructed, and then all of the combined choirs of the town would get together and serve as the choir for these revival meetings. Nobody better embodied the ideal of muscular Christianity than Billy Sunday. Now, you all heard of Billy Sunday? Probably no, not okay. Billy Sunday was the single most charismatic of all of the revivalists. He was a professional baseball player, played for the Pittsburgh Pirates, and then heard the call to preach Jesus, gave it up, and he was absolutely electrifying from everything that has been written about him. And he was also very, very pugnacious. So he had this typical act that he would go through, in which at the beginning of his talk, he would throw off his coat, and he would roll up his sleeves, and he would rip off his collar, and he would announce that he was getting ready to fight Satan. That's just part of his act. But he was renowned for his calling people out. There would inevitably be hecklers, oftentimes hundreds of hecklers, that would show up at Billy Sunday rallies. He quite enjoyed that and counted on it, because then he would engage in banter with them and attack them from the pulpit, and the crowds just delighted in this. So he was notorious and incredibly effective. This is a Billy Sunday promotional card from Marshalltown, Iowa, announcing he's in Marshalltown, he's getting ready to go to Cedar Rapids. Now this is early in his career, because later he only went to really big cities. But you can see, he would send these cards out in advance of his arrival. And a voice was heard from a city which is called Marshalltown, which saith, make smooth the path for Billy. Now, Billy, being a big man and exceeding full of power, and of bad report among the anvil chorus are the people that are hecklers, many of the lambs of the flock were badly smitten and shivered in their socks. And then another voice was heard which saith, build ye me a tabernacle against my coming. But the Hittites and the Nevelites and the tightwads did laugh and jest. But their noise rose up as the smoke of soft coal and was lost in the fleecy clouds, while Beelzebubby twitched his tail and wore a look like 23. And in those days the preachers arose, and even the lambs and sheep of the flock. In the day of 5 sons there was built a shed. Now oftentimes it would actually be 1 son. It would build a shed, which by interpretation is called tabernacle. 4 square it stood, and underneath 8,000 seats for sinners laid. And in the rear for singers sweet 800 seats, the count thereof. And thus was the tabernacle built, and many were the mashed thumbs. And who shall count the cost? Like wise men, let wise men count, for fools are only fools. Amen. First epistle to the Rapid Cityites. He's going to see the rapids. Here is the Billy Sunday Tabernacle in Omaha. There is one of my former students at UNK wrote a master's thesis about this particular revival and the politics behind it. And one of the interesting things we found was Omaha was going through a struggle at the time over the question of prohibition in Omaha, whether to go dry. And the people who were on the side of going dry were in the forefront of the committee that invited Billy Sunday to come, because they knew he was going to go after alcohol in his revival meeting, which he did. But this could hold 8,000 people. And this particular revival was typical of his big city revivals. It went on for 3 weeks. Every day, 3 sermons a day. Jam-packed. This is the interior of a Billy Sunday Tabernacle in Toledo, Ohio. You can notice it's from 1911. Interior Billy Sunday Tabernacle, 160 feet wide, 220 feet long, seats 10,000 people. And he made this quote before he arrived in Toledo, which was widely publicized: "I will fight until hell freezes over." And he even offered $10,000 to anybody who could prove that he was a fraud or a failure. That he's coming to fight Satan, and he offers a cash prize, which of course would bring out hecklers, which is what he wanted. Now, there were also rural revivals and evangelists that focused on small towns and frontier communities, such as this fellow right here, Charles Organ. This one's Organ. Charles Organ and his wife next to him, and his 2 of his helpers and 1 of his helpers' wives. They were into the singing and kind of background organizing. Among the hundreds of 10 evangelists then is Charles Organ. He was a disciple of Christ minister from Des Moines, Iowa. And in 1910, there was a young man named Homer Hagen who had gone to college in Des Moines, and he was a disciple of Christ. He got to be friends of Organ, and he then got a job in Palisades, Colorado. And he invited Organ to come to Palisades to do a revival. And I just happened to luck out on, about 15 years ago, a postcard album that Homer Hagen had collected, in which there was this remarkable series of documents, or postcards documenting this otherwise completely lost, inaccessible event. So at any rate, on the back of this card, we have this little note that Organ sends to Hagen, telling him how to prepare. It will be about 1 month before we pass your way. Keep up interest in concert. So the idea is that everybody in concert together. In concert among endeavors. Now what it's referring to here is a large international youth movement called the Christian Endeavor Movement. And there's a local chapter apparently in Palisades. Try to get them to decide on it, coming to the meetings. If they push it, they will do well. We may arrive a few hours early and help boost it. This is not very well written here, but he makes reference to, he has 2,000 feet of funny moving pictures. So you can see that they're also using advertising. This is just about Jesus, folks. This is entertainment. 2,000 feet of funny moving pictures and a fine machine, which is useful, of course, for advertising purposes. Here is a postcard, gospel meeting tonight, showing, this is the Organ card that you can circulate around town. Debate and discussion, a storm, is threatening to sink the Church of Christ. But It is triumphantly sailing through, battered but still afloat, while humanism and error are sinking. And yea, the thunderbolt is coming from the storm. Truth striking the bow of error. So at any rate, it also is interesting that dogmas are going down. Now, in some church traditions, dogma is a good thing. But this guy's a disciple of Christ. And in the disciples of Christ, the belief is that there's no creed but the Bible. They don't like dogmas. They consider dogmas to be man-made. So dogmas are going down along with humanism and error. But the Church of Christ is triumphantly sailing through the storm. Postcards could come in all kinds. Very simple, like this, or more like this, or my favorite. You gotta love it. I mean, I started thinking, what was the dog's name, and how did they get him to hold still, and you know. And I'm guessing this was just for the photo. I doubt that the dog was actually good enough to ride around town like this, but it's a nice postcard anyways. Here is Oregon and Hagen among the cowboys with the tent in the background. And here you have him, the tent in the background with the local church next to it with the cowgirls, if you will. Some of them have rifles. And it says, Mother, this is the tent in which we are now holding the meeting. 8 confessions the first 10 days. Now for Palisades, 8 confessions in 10 days must have been pretty good. For Billy Sunday, that would have been profoundly disappointing because he oftentimes would have people in the hundreds every single sermon answering his altar call to make a decision for Christ. All right, so I have the question, failure of the crusade. As I say, Christian Protestants have been trying to shape American culture all the way back to the very beginning, and it's never succeeded as well as they hoped. Their aspirations always exceeded their successes. Now, make no mistake about it, folks. Organized religion has been a huge and often successful vehicle for achieving social reform and change in America. But my point is that the idea of creating a completely regenerated society that conforms to the notion of biblical godliness, that has never worked. Not from the first generation of Puritans on. So the Golden Age of Postcards also richly documents the lives of people who were Catholic, Jewish, Muslim, and secular, and all the popular pastimes that Protestant reformers wished to curb, unsuccessfully. Postcards also document the resistance to Protestant efforts to police the nation's morals, which I will illustrate in a moment, especially the campaign to prohibit the manufacture, sale, and transport of liquor. It has been argued that national prohibition, it was enacted in 1919, it took effect in 1920, is the kind of the high tide of Protestant influence on American national public policy. But, as you all know, it was never effectively enforced, and it was repealed only 13 years later, in December of 1933. And so the lesson is the efforts at culture war have not been spectacularly successful in American history. So here are some cards that illustrate the pushback against the Protestant crusade. Now, I have to explain, there is hundreds of different versions of comic cards that were produced. And one common motif in comic cards involved people who were obviously intoxicated, drunk cards. And this is actually not a religious card at all, it's a drunk card. And the only part of the actual published card is this up here. Come early and avoid the rush. With a guy who's obviously supposed to be intoxicated leading the crowd into what's probably a restaurant or a bar or something. But some wag took this card and put this personal message on it. For there will be a big crowd at Sunday school in the morning. It's rally day, you know. Teacher. I like that. Or this, I have a whole series of these. I just picked one. This, by the way, is from a guy in Nebraska. This protracted meetings will be opened Sunday evening by the Reverend Peter Inskip. Brother Inskip's name is really Hezekiah, but in his boyhood he was given the nickname of Peter, and that same Peter hangs to him yet. I have another one about the pastor will join with the organist in a solo in debt. And, you know, it's just bad grammar. And the back of it is fascinating. It's from New York City. And it was from a young Jewish woman to a young Jewish woman friend talking about the big night that they had had the night before with the boys and how one of them had lost her handbag and they had forgotten it. And they were going to get together at a tavern to exchange and return the handbag. And on the front of it is one of these. And I find it fascinating that here you have these young Jewish women in New York City who, out of all the literally hundreds of designs of cards that they could have selected to send this message, they went to one that was mocking the Protestant Crusade. Or this one. One of the most common motifs was the water wagon card. So the water wagon was the nickname for people getting on board with you know, giving up booze. And when somebody decided to sign a pledge saying that they would avoid alcohol in the future, it's called getting on the water wagon. And there were literally hundreds. I have lots of them, water wagon cards, where it was very common for people when they decided to do this, they would send to friends this card saying, I'm on the water wagon now. Well, here we have the card saying, I don't care. Or this one, Mr. Snide Reformer. Your portrait here, my pious friend, I take the liberty to send, that from it you may clearly know your false pretenses do not go. Down with liquor, it says. Yet he has in his hip pocket a bottle. Or this one, I'm a good shot. Or this one, this is spoofing the single largest of the temperance organizations was the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which also was a very big force in the women's suffrage movement. A lot of prohibitionists pushed women's suffrage also because they believed that if women could vote, they would vote in prohibition. At any rate, so here we have the Ladies Sponge Club down with liquor. This female, whose one inspiration was that rum meant eternal tarnation, put our town on the blink in her campaign on drink, and we dried up with liquid starvation. Or this one, after the passage of the Volstead Act, there is a series of cards that came out. The natural born prohibition. The camel's the national emblem today, in place of the eagle who fluttered away. When the grand and glorious land of the free placed the word prohibition above liberty. So that is all I'm going to say now. Do you have any questions? I don't know what time it is. It's time to go. I did that. I usually go over. I'm proud of myself. I never do this. Do you have any questions? Yeah.
The Ku Klux Klan had a big rise in the late 20s.
Yeah, the 20s especially, yeah.
Was it affected by any of these postcards or this Protestant movement? Because the
yeah.
Klan tried to make it connect religion and...
Yes. Well, there's, I mean, obviously not, most Protestants were not members of the Klan. It is also true that most of the Klan were Protestant. And they very definitely identified themselves as a Protestant organization. In the 20s, they were anti-Catholic and anti-Jewish, as well as, white supremacist. And so you do see there are a lot of Klan postcards, and you do see the fusion of religion, cross-country, and specifically anti-Semitism and anti-Catholicism on a lot of the Klan advertising, yeah. But it's important to note that a lot of the cards I'm showing you, these people are not necessarily Klan at all, and many of them, particularly the modernists, would have been against the Klan. So.
Well, it's kind of before the rise anyway.
Yeah.
What happened to the mountain with the cross on it?
It literally became a national monument for a while, or a national, I can't remember if it was a monument or a park. And then in the 1930s, it went away. And I'd love to get into the archives of the National Park Service and find out about this, first the movement to make it a national park, and how it was used and how it was marketed, and then the politics behind it going away as a park. Because You know, I don't know if you've ever, I mean, I've tried to see it when I went through Colorado one time, and I couldn't see it from where I
I
was.
think it's in Rocky Mountain National Park.
Is it in Rocky Mountain National? I'm told though that today it's not really accessible, but the Union Pacific, at least at one point, had one line where you could see it out a window. And Protestants made a big deal out of this in the late 19th century, that how do you explain this? It must be proof of design, right? That God the Creator hath carved a perfect cross that is there year round. It's a deep crevice and the snow never melted. It's a crusader's cross. And this was before any person of European descent, any Christian, ever came to America. He was clearly marking America as God's chosen place. And then this shows up in Protestant letterheads of Protestant organizations all over the United States in the late 19th century. So, any other questions? Yeah.
Just curious about the production of all of these cards. So, were these sort of locally created, produced things by denominations, or were there corporations that got involved in this?
Yes, all of the above.
Yeah.
So, I mean, once the government gave up its monopolized and privatized it, anybody could get into the designing postcard business. So there were, publishers that specialized in producing postcards by the millions. There were organizations that would design postcards for their particular organization. Denominations would make denominational cards. And then there were local churches that could just use their own little Kodak camera, go out, take a picture, and make limited run cards just for their local members. You can make them by the one, you can make them by the millions. So, yeah.
And postcards were only 2 cents even in the 50s, as I remember.
Yep, they started off 1 cent, and then one of the interesting things is the revenue brought in by the postal, U.S. Post Office just dramatically jumped because of postcards. But then, because of the increased business, they had to hire more staff. Then they raised the rates from 1 cent to 2 cents, which was still cheap, but. Yes?
The size of the postcard, was that regulated, the dimensions? Because I see earlier postcards were a different size and
Yeah,
now they're.
in the 19th century, they were much smaller. Then there was a standard size. I wish I had one here. There was a standard size until, like the late 20s. And then they began to allow jumbo size cards too. But in this era, there's no jumbos. They were all one standard size. And I want to say it was 3.5 by 5.5 inches. Yes?
Is there, in the latter years of this, are there areas that were more involved and areas that were less involved?
You mean with the postcards or with the movement?
So the basic idea of, well, postcards, yes, but the religious part of it.
Yeah, there were regional differences. So,
South or north or east or west?
in general, all the various different organizations that had a liberal or modernist bent tended to be more prevalent in the North and Midwest. And the South tended to be much more resistant to the social gospel. They still had Sunday schools, but they were much more focused on Sunday schools as a path to personal conversion and biblical instruction, and less with Sunday schools as a vehicle for mobilizing people for political ends.
What are the date ranges of your cards? You say you have thousands.
Well, yeah, I bring them right up to
No,
present.
but
Like
I
I have
mean-
1960s cards from the counterculture.
Okay,
right?
but I mean, yeah, no, but I mean for this presentation here, was it like 1909 to 1920?
This is the most recent one right here.
Which is?
This would have been 1920, right after Prohibition went into effect. So, this presentation stops with the 1920
Yeah.
card. Yes,
Where have you found most of your cards?
all over. I'm a, my colleagues know I go into thrift stores and antique shops and all. I'm just an inveterate collector of stuff. Cat rat, actually. It's a terrible sin. My wife will tell you, there's no place for us to live because of the stuff I do. So at any rate, I started when I was just like an 8 or 9 year old, and been at it ever since. And I break for antique shops, I break for flea markets, I break for thrift stores, and I always ask, you got any postcards? And you find them in all kinds of places. Yeah.
Churches are still using them. I gave you a card from First Baptist Church last week.
There, you see?
We mailed postcards from the state fair last year.
Okay.
We do them every year.
So it's not a dinosaur totally yet. Endangered but not extinct. Any other questions? Yes.
Are there any well-known artists that are associated with the Protestant?
Sure, you've probably heard of Solomon Butcher, from a photographer here in Nebraska. Yeah, I mean, his studio cranked out, I have no idea how many postcards. Well, yes, Solomon Butcher would, okay, one of the things that churches, I mean, first of all, folks, every institution in America, high schools, you name it, had a picture taken of it. So if you went into a drugstore in the early 20th century, they'd have a rack of all the, so if you're a visitor, and you want to show people something about where you are, just go into the drugstore and buy a postcard. And photography studios would have the same thing available, postcards from their town. Solomon Butcher took pictures of churches all over Nebraska. And I've got a lot of Solomon Butcher church postcards. Yeah. They not as most, obviously looking at a building is not as exciting as looking at trains stuck in the snow or something. So his most famous paintings, images are not church postcards, but he did a lot of church postcards. Yeah. And high schools and junior highs and everything else. Yeah. Any other questions?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, my goodness.